There's a kind of pain that almost nobody talks about openly. The kind that leaves you lying awake at night, trying to understand how someone who once made you feel deeply wanted can suddenly begin treating you like you barely matter at all. And what makes it even more confusing is that the colder they become, the more you can feel that there is still something there beneath the surface, something unfinished, something conflicted. Because when it comes to avoidant people, love does not always create closeness. Sometimes love creates fear. And the more emotionally important you become to them, the more their walls begin rising in ways that can leave you emotionally shattered. At first, everything often feels different, easy, light, natural. They open up just enough to make you feel chosen. You notice the moments of vulnerability hidden beneath their calm exterior, the late-night conversations, the emotional honesty that appears unexpectedly, the way they slowly let you into spaces they usually keep guarded from everyone else. And because of that, you start believing the connection is growing stronger. That trust is deepening. That love is finally becoming safe between the two of you. But then something shifts. Not loudly at first, not in a way that immediately makes sense. It happens quietly. Their energy changes after emotional closeness. They become distant after intimate moments, slower to reply, harder to reach emotionally. Conversations begin feeling colder. The warmth that once felt natural suddenly feels inconsistent, and without realizing it, you begin trying harder to get back the version of them that once felt emotionally available. That is the part that hurts the most, because you can feel the connection. You know what you experienced was real, yet somehow, the more emotionally invested you become, the more disconnected they seem to grow. And eventually you start asking yourself the question that silently destroys so many people emotionally. If they care about me, why do they treat me this way? What most people never realize is that avoidant behavior is often deeply connected to emotional fear, not emotional absence. To someone with avoidant patterns, closeness can feel dangerous once it becomes emotionally significant. The moment the relationship starts carrying emotional weight, their nervous system begins reacting as if something unsafe is happening, even if the relationship itself is healthy. And that contradiction can break your heart if you do not understand it. Because naturally, love makes most people move closer. But for an avoidant person, love can trigger the urge to create distance instead. Not because you are unworthy, not because you loved too much, but because emotional intimacy activates fears they learned long before you ever entered their life. And the tragic part is that many avoidants do not even fully understand this within themselves. They just feel overwhelmed. Pressure they cannot explain, emotions they cannot regulate, vulnerability that suddenly feels suffocating instead of comforting. So instead of leaning deeper into the connection, they begin unconsciously protecting themselves from it. And unfortunately, the person they often hurt the most is the person they care about the most, because casual connections feel safer to them. Surface-level relationships do not activate deep emotional dependency. There's no risk of losing themselves emotionally, no fear of being truly seen, no fear of needing someone too deeply. But when you become important, everything changes internally for them. The emotional stakes rise, and with those emotional stakes comes fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of abandonment, fear of losing control, fear of emotional dependence, fear of eventually getting hurt. And because avoidants often survive emotionally by suppressing uncomfortable feelings instead of processing them, they create distance the moment closeness starts feeling too real. That is why some of the coldest moments happen right after the warmest ones, right after intimacy, right after emotional connection, right after vulnerability, right after you finally start feeling secure. Because while you are experiencing closeness as safety, they may be experiencing closeness as emotional exposure. And emotional exposure terrifies them more than loneliness does. That's why so many people become trapped, trying to earn consistency from someone who only knows how to feel safe through emotional distance. They start overanalyzing everything, wondering what changed, wondering if they became too emotional, too available, too loving. They begin shrinking themselves emotionally just to avoid pushing the avoidant further away. But the painful truth is that the closer you get to an avoidant heart, the more likely you are to encounter the defenses protecting it. And those defenses can feel brutal when you're on the receiving end of them, Because suddenly the person who once seemed emotionally connected starts becoming hard to read. They avoid serious conversations. They withdraw when emotions deepen. They become irritated by closeness they once welcomed. Affection becomes inconsistent. Their silence grows heavier. And eventually you start feeling emotionally alone while still technically being in the relationship. That confusion creates emotional addiction because the human mind naturally chases inconsistency harder than certainty. When someone gives love and distance interchangeably, your nervous system starts clinging to the moments of warmth while trying desperately to avoid the coldness. You keep hoping the loving version of them will return permanently. You replay old memories, old conversations, old moments where they made you feel chosen, and every small moment of affection starts feeling emotionally enormous because it temporarily relieves the pain their distance created. But what you may not realize is that the avoidant person is often trapped too, internally fighting battles they rarely speak about openly. Because part of them genuinely wants connection. They crave love, they crave understanding, they crave emotional safety. But another part of them has been conditioned to associate deep attachment with danger, pressure, disappointment, or loss of independence, so they begin living in emotional contradiction, wanting closeness while fearing it at the exact same time, missing you while pulling away from you, caring deeply while acting emotionally detached, and unless they become aware of these patterns, they often hurt the very people they never actually wanted to lose. That's why the deeper your importance becomes, the more intense their internal conflict can grow, because now it's no longer casual. Now losing you would actually hurt, and ironically that emotional risk itself can trigger even more avoidance. Many people think avoidants are emotionally unaffected, but often they are emotionally overwhelmed in ways they do not know how to communicate. Instead of expressing fear openly, they suppress it. Instead of saying, "I'm scared of needing you," they create distance. Instead of saying, "I'm overwhelmed by how much I feel," they become cold. Instead of admitting vulnerability, they retreat into silence, and the person on the other side experiences that retreat as rejection. That's why loving an avoidant can feel emotionally devastating if you do not understand the psychology beneath it, because their behavior starts contradicting the emotional connection you know exists underneath. You feel loved one moment and emotionally abandoned the next, and slowly, without noticing, your emotional world begins revolving around trying to feel emotionally safe again, trying to bring back the closeness, trying to stop the distance, trying to avoid triggering their withdrawal. But love was never supposed to feel like emotional survival. And the saddest part is that many people stay trapped in this cycle because they mistake emotional inconsistency for emotional depth. They believe the intensity means the connection is rare, but intensity and emotional safety are not the same thing. Real love does not constantly leave you questioning your worth. Real connection does not require you to abandon your emotional needs just to maintain proximity to someone. Yet when you love an avoidant deeply, it becomes incredibly easy to lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who is simultaneously pulling you closer and pushing you away. Especially because there are moments where their love feels real, powerfully real. The way they look at you sometimes, the vulnerability they accidentally reveal, the moments where their walls briefly collapse and you glimpse the softness beneath all the distance. Those moments become emotionally unforgettable because they show you who they could be if fear did not control them. But potential is not the same as emotional availability, and this is where so many hearts break, not because the connection lacked emotion, but because fear became stronger than consistency. The avoidant begins associating the relationship with emotional pressure instead of emotional peace. Even healthy closeness can start feeling overwhelming once they fear expectations, dependence, or vulnerability. They may begin convincing themselves they need space, more independence, less emotional intensity. And instead of communicating this calmly, many create distance abruptly because emotional confrontation itself feels uncomfortable. That sudden shift leaves the other person emotionally spiraling, trying to understand how love transformed into emotional distance so quickly. But to the avoidant, the relationship often began feeling too real, and too real activates every unresolved emotional wound they spent years trying to outrun. That's why the more you matter, the worse they sometimes treat you. Not because your love lacks value, but because your importance activates fears they do not know how to manage. And if they never confront those fears internally, they may continue repeating the same cycle with every meaningful relationship they enter. Getting close, feeling vulnerable, pulling away, creating pain, missing the connection, returning emotionally. then repeating the entire cycle again. Meanwhile, the person who loved them sincerely is left carrying confusion, anxiety, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion from trying to make sense of behavior that constantly contradicts itself. But eventually, there comes a moment where something begins changing inside you too. A moment where you slowly start realizing that someone else's inability to handle closeness is not proof that you are hard to love. Their fear is not your failure. Their withdrawal is not your worth. And no matter how deeply you care about someone, you cannot heal wounds they are still protecting more than confronting. Because love can invite healing, but it cannot force emotional readiness. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that the people who feel the deepest emotions are not always the people most capable of sustaining healthy love. Sometimes they are the people most terrified of it, and that is the invisible heartbreak so many people never see coming. Because when you first meet someone emotionally avoidant, their distance rarely appears immediately. In the beginning, they often seem calm, self-controlled, independent, even emotionally mature. Their mystery feels attractive. Their emotional restraint feels safe compared to chaotic love. And when they slowly begin opening up to you, it feels meaningful because you understand how guarded they normally are. So naturally, you believe the walls coming down means trust is growing. You believe the relationship is progressing. You believe love is becoming deeper. But what many people do not realize is that for avoidance, emotional closeness often feels manageable only until it reaches a certain depth. There comes a point where the relationship stops feeling safe and enjoyable and starts feeling emotionally exposing. And once that emotional threshold is crossed, their nervous system begins reacting in ways that even they may not fully understand. That is when the emotional walls suddenly become stronger instead of weaker, not because feelings disappeared, but because feelings became too powerful. And the deeper the emotional bond grows, the more vulnerable they feel to pain, disappointment, abandonment, or loss of control. So instead of surrendering to the connection, they instinctively start protecting themselves from it. This is why some avoidants become colder, right when the relationship starts becoming serious, right when love deepens, right when commitment becomes real, right when emotional intimacy starts feeling permanent. They may begin creating subtle distance at first, taking longer to respond, becoming emotionally distracted, needing more space, acting irritated by emotional conversations they once welcomed, pulling away after moments of closeness. And because these changes happen gradually, you often do not notice the emotional shift until you already feel deeply attached. Then suddenly you find yourself carrying the emotional weight of the relationship almost alone. You start initiating most conversations, trying to reconnect emotionally, trying to restore the warmth that once existed naturally, trying to understand what happened, and without realizing it, you begin abandoning your own emotional peace in order to maintain proximity to someone who is slowly disconnecting from you internally. That is the trap. Because once an avoidant starts suppressing their emotional overwhelm, they often stop communicating honestly about what is happening inside them. Not necessarily because they want to deceive you, but because many of them genuinely struggle understanding their own emotional reactions in real time. They only know they feel pressure, overwhelm, the urge to escape emotionally. So instead of saying, "I'm scared of how important you've become to me," they convince themselves something must be wrong with the relationship itself. And this is where self-sabotage quietly begins. They start focusing on flaws, finding reasons to create emotional distance, questioning the relationship, becoming emotionally unavailable in subtle but painful ways. Not because the connection lacks meaning, but because the meaning itself feels overwhelming. And for the person who loves them, this creates a kind of emotional confusion that slowly erodes self-worth, because you begin feeling punished for loving sincerely, punished for caring deeply, punished for becoming emotionally safe. The very things that should strengthen a relationship somehow become the exact things creating distance. And that contradiction can leave someone emotionally shattered, especially because avoidants rarely look emotionally cruel on the surface. Most are not intentionally trying to destroy people. Many genuinely care. Many feel guilt. Many experience internal conflict. But emotional suppression creates damage even when harm was never the intention. Because love without emotional availability eventually turns into emotional inconsistency. And emotional inconsistency creates anxiety in the person trying to hold the connection together. You begin watching their mood carefully, analyzing every text, overthinking every silence, searching for reassurance in tiny moments of affection. And the more emotionally unpredictable they become, the more emotionally hyper-aware you become, until eventually your nervous system stops feeling safe entirely. That is why relationships with avoidance can become so psychologically exhausting. Not because there is no love present, but because love is constantly interrupted by fear-driven withdrawal. One moment they pull you close, the next moment they seem emotionally unreachable. And over time, your mind becomes addicted to trying to solve the inconsistency. You keep believing if you can just love them correctly, they will stop pulling away. If you can just avoid pressuring them, they will finally feel safe. If you can just be patient enough, understanding enough, calm enough, healing enough, eventually the walls will disappear permanently. But emotional walls built over years do not disappear simply because someone offers love, especially when those walls were originally created for survival. Most avoidants learned early in life that emotional vulnerability was unsafe in some way. Maybe emotions were dismissed, maybe affection felt inconsistent, maybe closeness led to pain, criticism, rejection, or emotional suffocation, so they adapted by becoming emotionally self-reliant, independent, detached from vulnerability. And that adaptation helped them survive emotionally. But survival patterns that protect you from pain can also block you from intimacy later in life. Because healthy love requires emotional openness, and openness feels terrifying to someone whose nervous system associates vulnerability with danger. That is why avoidants often feel safest when relationships remain emotionally controlled. The moment feelings become too deep, too vulnerable, too emotionally significant, panic begins surfacing underneath the surface. And panic does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like emotional numbness, distance, coldness, withdrawal, silence, sudden confusion about the relationship, the desire for space, the urge to emotionally escape. And unfortunately, the person experiencing that withdrawal often internalizes it personally. They start asking themselves painful questions. Am I too much? Did I ruin the relationship? Why were they loving before but distant now? Why do they treat strangers with more kindness than me? And perhaps the most painful question of all, how can someone care about me and still hurt me this deeply? The answer is painful because it exists inside emotional contradiction. Avoidants often care deeply while simultaneously lacking the emotional capacity to sustain closeness consistently. Their feelings may be real, but their fear is real too. And until someone becomes conscious of those fear-driven patterns, love alone cannot override them. That is why so many avoidants unintentionally hurt the people who matter most. Because the more emotionally important you become, the more emotionally vulnerable they feel to losing you. And instead of leaning into that vulnerability, they unconsciously defend themselves against it. Sometimes by becoming emotionally unavailable, sometimes by disconnecting emotionally before the other person can, sometimes by creating enough distance to regain the illusion of emotional control. And from the outside, it can look unbelievably cruel, because while you are trying harder to connect, they are trying harder to regulate their internal overwhelm by pulling away. You move closer. They move backward. You seek reassurance. They seek space. You try to talk. They shut down. And slowly, the relationship becomes defined by emotional imbalance instead of mutual safety, one person fighting for connection, the other fighting their fear of it. And eventually exhaustion begins replacing intimacy. Because no matter how deeply you love someone, constantly feeling emotionally unwanted begins damaging the soul. You start feeling lonely, even beside the person you love. You start suppressing your own needs just to avoid triggering more withdrawal. You stop expressing emotions freely because you fear becoming too much. And this is where many people lose themselves completely. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly. You become emotionally focused on maintaining connection instead of maintaining yourself. Your moods begin depending on their availability. Your peace depends on whether they are warm or distant that day. Your emotional stability becomes tied to their inconsistency. And without realizing it, the relationship slowly becomes emotionally consuming. Because intermittent affection creates powerful attachment, the moments of closeness feel so relieving after periods of distance that they become emotionally intoxicating. Every small sign of warmth feels like hope returning. Every vulnerable moment feels like proof the relationship can still survive. So you keep holding on, even while hurting, even while feeling emotionally neglected, even while constantly questioning where you truly stand. Because part of you remembers the version of them that once felt emotionally open, the version that made you feel deeply seen, and you keep believing that version will fully return if you just love them enough. But love cannot permanently stabilize someone who still fears emotional intimacy internally. And this becomes even more painful because avoidants themselves are often suffering too. Many feel intense guilt after withdrawing. Many miss the person deeply once distance grows. Many replay the relationship privately in ways they never admit openly. But instead of confronting those emotions directly, they often suppress them again because emotional discomfort feels overwhelming, so they appear detached externally while carrying unresolved emotional conflict internally. That is why avoidants sometimes seem unaffected immediately after creating distance, only to feel the emotional impact much later, once the pressure of intimacy fades and the reality of loss begins settling in. Because avoidants often process emotions in reverse. When closeness is present, fear dominates. When distance is present, feelings resurface, and by the time they fully feel the loss emotionally, the other person may already be exhausted from carrying the relationship alone for too long. That is one of the deepest tragedies of avoidant relationships. The love often exists, but emotional timing becomes completely misaligned. One person begs for closeness, while the other feels overwhelmed by it. Then, once the overwhelmed person finally begins missing the connection deeply, the other person has already become emotionally drained from fighting for love alone. And somewhere inside all of this pain, an important realization slowly begins emerging. You cannot force someone to feel safe with intimacy. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot heal fear for someone who still depends on avoidance to feel emotionally protected. And perhaps most importantly, someone struggling to receive love consistently is not proof that your love lacked value, because the deeper truth is this: avoidants do not pull away because you meant nothing. Many pull away because you meant too much. And for a long time, that realization can feel almost impossible to accept. Because when someone keeps hurting you, distancing themselves from you, confusing you, or emotionally disappearing from the relationship, your mind naturally assumes the problem must be a lack of love. It feels easier to believe they simply do not care than to understand that someone can care deeply and still lack the emotional ability to sustain closeness in a healthy way. But this is where the emotional reality of avoidance becomes painfully complicated, because many avoidants are not running from love itself. They are running from what love awakens inside them: the vulnerability, the dependency, the emotional exposure, the fear of losing control, the possibility of abandonment, the possibility of needing someone too much. And when those fears become activated, avoidance becomes their way of emotionally regulating themselves. Distance feels safer than vulnerability. Silence feels safer than emotional confrontation. Independence feels safer than emotional reliance. So even while part of them desperately wants connection, another part begins resisting it at the exact same time. That internal battle is exhausting, not only for the person loving them, but often for the avoidant too, because eventually they begin feeling the emotional consequences of their own defenses. Not immediately, not always visibly, but quietly, in the moments where the distance becomes too real, where your absence begins settling into their daily life, where the emotional safety you once provided is suddenly no longer available to them. That is when many avoidants begin confronting feelings they spent so long suppressing. And this is something many people misunderstand about avoidance. Emotional suppression is not emotional absence. Just because someone does not openly express pain does not mean they do not feel it. Many avoidants feel emotions deeply beneath the surface. They simply learned to disconnect from those emotions as a survival strategy long ago. So instead of processing pain directly, they compartmentalize it, distract themselves from it, rationalize it, numb it, avoid it. But suppressed emotions do not disappear. They wait. And eventually, when the relationship truly begins slipping away, the emotional reality often catches up to them. That is why avoidants sometimes seem emotionally detached during the relationship, yet deeply affected after separation. Because when intimacy exists, their fear system stays activated. But once distance removes the immediate pressure of vulnerability, they finally have enough emotional space to feel what they were suppressing all along. And by then, it can hit them harder than anyone realizes. The memories, the regret, the unresolved emotions, the realization of what they lost, the awareness of how deeply someone actually loved them, and perhaps most painfully of all, the awareness that their own fear may have destroyed something they genuinely wanted. But even then, many avoidants still struggle expressing these emotions openly because vulnerability continues feeling dangerous. So instead of directly saying, "I miss you," they may send subtle signals, small attempts at reconnecting, quiet curiosity about your life, indirect emotional openings that never fully say what they truly feel. And this is where many people become trapped again emotionally. Because the moment the avoidant reappears, all the unresolved hope returns too. The hope that maybe this time things will finally change, maybe now they understand, maybe now they're ready, maybe now the love will finally become stable. And sometimes, avoidants do become more self-aware over time. Some genuinely begin recognizing their patterns, some seek healing, some slowly learn emotional vulnerability, some confront the fears they spent years avoiding. Growth is absolutely possible, but growth only happens when someone becomes willing to face themselves honestly, not when they continue escaping discomfort through emotional withdrawal. And this distinction matters deeply because many people spend years waiting for emotional potential instead of accepting emotional reality. They fall in love with who the avoidant could become rather than honestly facing who they currently are. And hope can become dangerous when it keeps you emotionally attached to inconsistency, especially because avoidants often do show glimpses of deep love, moments of softness, moments of emotional honesty, moments where their walls briefly fall and you see the tenderness underneath all the fear. Those moments are real, but isolated moments of emotional openness are not the same thing as sustained emotional availability, and confusing the two can keep someone trapped in emotional pain for far too long. Because healthy love is not measured by emotional intensity alone, it is measured by consistency, safety, communication, emotional presence, the ability to stay connected, even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. And this is where many people finally begin reaching a breaking point emotionally, not because they stopped loving the avoidant, but because they became exhausted from abandoning themselves, exhausted from carrying emotional uncertainty every day, exhausted from constantly questioning their worth, exhausted from shrinking their needs to avoid pushing someone away. Eventually, there comes a moment where the pain of losing yourself becomes heavier than the pain of losing the relationship. And that moment changes everything. Because for the first time, your focus slowly starts shifting away from trying to make them stay and starts returning back toward yourself, back toward your emotional peace, back toward your self-respect, back toward the parts of you that became lost inside the emotional chaos of constantly chasing reassurance. And strangely enough, this shift often changes the emotional dynamic completely. Because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, even when that pressure is unintentional. The more someone anxiously pursues connection, the more overwhelmed avoidants often feel internally. But when that pursuit stops, when your energy finally begins detaching emotionally from needing constant reassurance, something unexpected often happens. The avoidant starts feeling the absence of your emotional presence more deeply. Not because you manipulated them, not because you played games, but because your emotional energy is no longer constantly available for them to lean on unconsciously. And suddenly the distance they once created themselves begins feeling real. The silence becomes heavier. The emotional safety you once provided is no longer surrounding them in the same way. And for many avoidants, this is when buried emotions finally begin surfacing more intensely. Because they are no longer reacting to the pressure of intimacy in the present moment. Now they are confronting the possibility of genuine loss instead. And loss feels very different emotionally than closeness. Closeness activates fear. Loss activates grief. That is why some avoidants seem to wake up emotionally only after someone truly begins letting go. Not because they never cared before, but because fear stopped drowning out their feelings temporarily. And this creates one of the most emotionally confusing experiences imaginable for the person who loved them. Because suddenly the avoidant who once felt distant begins showing signs of emotion again, signs of missing you, signs of longing, signs of emotional vulnerability. And part of you wants to believe this means everything will finally become different. But this is where emotional clarity becomes essential. Because missing someone is not automatically the same thing as being emotionally ready for healthy love. Longing alone does not heal avoidance. Regret alone does not create emotional consistency. And temporary vulnerability does not automatically mean long-term emotional safety. Real change requires sustained self-awareness, the willingness to communicate openly, the willingness to remain emotionally present, even during discomfort, the willingness to stop running from vulnerability every time intimacy deepens, and without those changes, the cycle often repeats itself again. Closeness, fear, distance, longing, return, then distance all over again. That is why healing from avoidant relationships requires something incredibly difficult, accepting reality instead of surviving on emotional hope alone, because hope can keep people emotionally attached long after the relationship itself has stopped feeling emotionally safe. You keep remembering their potential, their softness, their hidden emotions, their moments of vulnerability, and you convince yourself those moments are the real version of them, but the emotionally unavailable behavior is also real. The withdrawal is real, the inconsistency is real, the inability to stay emotionally connected is real too, and healing begins when you stop separating someone's love from their behavior. Because no matter how deeply someone feels internally, healthy love still requires emotional responsibility externally. Without that responsibility, love slowly becomes pain disguised as connection. And perhaps this is the hardest truth many people eventually have to face. You can deeply understand why someone became avoidant and still recognize that their unresolved wounds are hurting you. Compassion does not require self-abandonment. Understanding someone's trauma does not mean accepting emotional neglect forever. And loving someone deeply does not mean you are meant to carry the entire emotional burden of the relationship alone. At some point, you have to ask yourself whether the connection is nurturing your soul or slowly draining it, because relationships should not constantly leave you starving for emotional safety. You should not have to earn basic consistency through exhaustion. You should not feel afraid to express needs, emotions, or vulnerability. And perhaps most importantly, you should never have to destroy your own emotional well-being just to remain close to someone who fears closeness themselves. That realization hurts deeply because sometimes the people we love most are also the people least capable of receiving love in healthy ways. And accepting that reality can feel like grieving someone who is still alive. But there is also freedom hidden inside that grief. Because the moment you stop measuring your worth through someone else's inability to stay emotionally present, you begin reclaiming yourself again, your peace, your clarity, your emotional stability, your sense of value beyond someone else's fear. And slowly, the relationship that once consumed your emotional world stops defining you completely. Not because the love was fake, but because you finally understand that someone else's fear of intimacy was never proof that you were too much to love. In fact, one of the most painful misunderstandings people carry after loving an avoidant is the belief that they somehow loved too much care, too much patience, too much emotional openness, too much understanding. But the truth is, genuine love only feels too much to someone who has been taught to fear emotional dependence. And when you spend enough time around avoidance, you can slowly begin treating your own emotional needs like burdens instead of recognizing them as normal human desires. You start apologizing for wanting consistency, apologizing for wanting reassurance, apologizing for wanting emotional presence, until eventually you become disconnected from your own instincts entirely. And that is what prolonged emotional inconsistency does to people. It makes them question their natural desire for closeness, as if it were weakness. But needing emotional safety is not weakness. Wanting communication is not weakness. Wanting someone to stay emotionally connected during difficult moments is not weakness. Those are the foundations of healthy love. And perhaps this is where the deepest transformation finally begins for someone who has spent so long emotionally trapped inside the avoidant cycle. The moment they stop asking, "How do I make this person love me consistently?" and begin asking, "Why have I been settling for inconsistency at the expense of myself?" That question changes everything, because suddenly the focus shifts, not toward blaming the avoidant, not toward hating them, not toward pretending the connection never mattered, but toward finally recognizing your own emotional exhaustion, honestly, recognizing how much of yourself you sacrificed trying to maintain a relationship that constantly kept you emotionally uncertain. Recognizing how often you abandoned your intuition in order to protect the connection, recognizing how much anxiety became normalized inside your daily life. And once you truly see that clearly, something inside you begins waking up emotionally. You begin realizing that love should not constantly feel like emotional survival. You begin realizing that peace matters too, that emotional stability matters too, that your nervous system deserves rest, not endless confusion. And this is where many people finally start understanding something profound about avoidance that changes the way they see the entire relationship. Avoidance is not emotional strength. It only looks like strength from the outside. The silence, the detachment, the independence, the emotional control. At first glance, it can seem powerful, like they are unaffected by emotional chaos, while everyone else struggles with vulnerability. But beneath that calm exterior is often someone deeply disconnected from their own emotional needs. Someone who learned to survive by suppressing parts of themselves that once felt unsafe to express. And survival should never be confused with peace, because true emotional strength is not the ability to avoid vulnerability. It is the ability to remain emotionally present despite vulnerability, to communicate instead of disappear, to stay connected instead of shutting down, to face fear instead of constantly escaping from it. That is real emotional maturity. And unfortunately, many avoidants spend years believing distance protects them from pain, while never realizing it also protects them from the depth of connection they secretly crave most. That is the tragedy hidden inside avoidance. The very walls built to prevent heartbreak eventually prevent intimacy too. And over time, those walls become lonely, even if the avoidant never fully admits it, because human beings are not designed to live emotionally disconnected forever. No matter how independent someone appears, the need for love, safety, understanding, and emotional connection still exists underneath. The difference is simply that avoidants learn to suppress those needs because needing others once felt dangerous. But suppressed needs do not disappear. They emerge quietly in other ways, in loneliness, in regret, in emotional emptiness, in relationships that never fully satisfy them, despite constantly searching for freedom. Because freedom without emotional closeness eventually becomes isolation, and many avoidants do not realize this until much later in life, after repeated patterns of emotional disconnection continue leaving them unfulfilled. That is why some eventually begin confronting themselves more honestly. They begin recognizing the cycle, the fear of closeness, the withdrawal, the emotional sabotage, the regret afterward. And for those willing to face it, healing truly is possible. But healing requires something avoidance naturally resists: radical emotional honesty. Honesty about fears, honesty about emotional wounds, honesty about the ways they hurt people they genuinely cared about. Honesty about the fact that distancing themselves never truly brought them peace, only temporary relief from vulnerability. And temporary relief is not healing, it is only escape. Real healing happens when someone stops running from intimacy and begins learning how to tolerate emotional closeness without seeing it as danger. When they learn that needing people does not make them weak. When they learn that vulnerability does not automatically end in abandonment. When they stop viewing emotional connection as something that steals freedom and begin experiencing it as something that deepens life instead. But that healing journey belongs to them, not to you. And this is the lesson many people struggle accepting after loving an avoidant deeply. You cannot heal someone by sacrificing yourself. You cannot prove your worth enough to remove someone else's fear. You cannot love another person so perfectly that it erases emotional wounds they refuse to confront internally. No amount of patience can substitute for self-awareness. No amount of love can replace emotional responsibility. And once you truly understand that, you stop personalizing their inability to stay emotionally available. You stop seeing their withdrawal as evidence that you were lacking, because their avoidance began long before you entered their life. Their fear existed before you. Their walls existed before you. And while your presence may have activated those fears more intensely because you mattered deeply to them, you were never the original cause of them. That realization can feel heartbreaking at first, because part of you still wishes love could have been enough. Part of you still remembers the beautiful moments, the softness hidden beneath their defenses, the connection that felt rare, the emotional depth that occasionally slipped through the cracks of their walls. And those moments mattered. They were real. But real love alone does not guarantee healthy love. And this is the distinction that finally frees people emotionally. Because someone can genuinely love you and still be incapable of giving you the emotional safety you deserve. Someone can miss you deeply and still repeat the same patterns if they never heal. Someone can feel regret and still struggle remaining emotionally present when intimacy returns. Love without emotional security eventually becomes painful no matter how strong the feelings are underneath. And many people spend years trying to survive on feelings alone while their emotional needs continue going unmet. But eventually there comes a moment where the soul grows tired of surviving emotionally unstable love, tired of uncertainty, tired of mixed signals, tired of constantly trying to decode someone else's silence, and that exhaustion often becomes the beginning of healing, because for the first time you stop trying to force clarity from someone else and begin creating clarity within yourself instead. You begin seeing the relationship through a different lens, not as proof that you were unlovable, but as proof of what happens when unhealed fear collides with genuine connection. And slowly the emotional fog begins lifting. You stop romanticizing emotional inconsistency. You stop confusing longing with stability. You stop chasing people who only know how to love from a distance, and most importantly, you begin returning back to yourself emotionally, back to your own center, back to your own worth, back to the version of yourself that existed before anxiety, confusion, and emotional exhaustion consumed your peace. That return is powerful, because healing after loving an avoidant is not only about letting go of another person, it is about rebuilding the relationship you have with yourself, learning to trust your emotions again, learning to honor your needs again, learning that love should feel safe, not constantly uncertain, learning that consistency is not boring, it is emotional security. And perhaps the most beautiful realization of all emerges quietly at the end of this journey. You were never asking for too much. You were simply asking the wrong person to give you what they had not yet learned how to give themselves: emotional presence, vulnerability, consistency, safety, connection without fear. And once you truly understand that, the shame begins leaving your heart. You stop blaming yourself for someone else's emotional limitations. You stop measuring your value through their inability to stay close. And slowly you begin opening your heart to a different kind of love entirely. A love where you do not have to earn reassurance through suffering. A love where communication does not disappear the moment emotions deepen. A love where vulnerability creates connection instead of distance. A love where emotional closeness is not treated like danger. Because despite everything this experience may have taught you about heartbreak, it also taught you something important about yourself. Your ability to love deeply was never the problem. And one day, when your love meets someone who no longer fears intimacy, it will finally stop feeling like something you constantly have to fight to keep.